As we continue the journey of exploring the God story, I want to introduce you to something that you may already know about it. So if you know about this, I'm going to remind you of it. If you've never heard of it, I want to introduce you to it. It's a literary device that's one of the most powerful literary devices there is in terms of writing a story or writing a movie or putting together something for people to watch and enjoy. And the device is this idea that's called rising action. Rising action is a series of incidents that create suspense, interest, and tension in a narrative that lead toward the climax of the story. I really began to pay attention to the rising action part of movies when my wife and I were raising our young boys. And we were in the throes of watching children's movies over and over and over again. Well, one of our favorites was Toy Story. Anybody ever seen Toy Story? Any of the Toy Story movies? Well, there's a part in every one of those movies where the toys get in trouble, right? Where Woody and Buzz Lightyear and the gang, in order to get from where they are to where they want to be, they've got to overcome some kind of challenge, some kind of obstacle, something that is happening that is this rising action in the story that they've got to get through in order to get to the other side. And we just started calling that part of the story when the toys get in trouble. And it's not just true for animated children's movies. It's true for almost any movie you watch. We also like to watch romantic comedies. And there's, if you watch romantic comedies, you know exactly what I mean. There is a point in every romantic comedy where you can turn to someone who's watching the movie with you, or you can just say to yourself, oh no, the toys are in trouble, right? Because the relationship is falling apart and something has happened in a way that it's got to be resolved in order for them to get where they want to be. This device is found in almost every story, and it's one of the most compelling parts of any story. In The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, there's this specific scene that just encapsulates and defines what I'm talking about when I mention this idea of rising action, as well as any scene in any movie does. What's happening in the story is Sam and Frodo, the two hobbits, they've been given charge of a ring that they've got to destroy. You may know the story. It's a very powerful and it's a very dangerous ring. And they're on their way to destroying it, to getting rid of it. But on their way, they run into a lot of trouble, a lot of challenges, a lot of worries and concerns. And so they find themselves at a point where they've got to decide, are we going to push forward or are we going to turn around and go back? I'm not going to tell you which way they choose because I just want you to watch and see and pay attention to kind of how Sam describes what this moment of tension and decision is like. That is, in a nutshell, what I mean when I talk about rising action. At the very beginning of the scene, you've got Sam saying to his friend, you've got Frodo saying to his friend, I just can't go on. It's just too hard. We've got to turn back. And then you've got Sam saying back to Frodo, who he calls Mr. Frodo, which I just find so endearing. Mr. Frodo, it's like those great stories. You know the ones that you can't forget. And when you heard them as a child, you didn't realize what made them so great. But I think I understand what makes them so great, Mr. Frodo. It's that at that point in time, when the heroes had the choice, do they move forward or do they go back? They didn't turn back because they believed in something bigger and something better. They knew that the hardships would pass. They were holding on to something that was worth fighting for, something good and something right. And they knew that in the great stories are the ones where when faced with challenge and confrontation and the moments of confusion and worry and wonder, do we go forward or do we go back? The great stories are the stories where they go forward. Oh, I love this scene in this movie. because it's just such great storytelling, and it isolates that tension and it lifts it up in such a way that you just can't help but see the struggle. Now, there's all kinds of stories in the God story, in the Bible, that have examples of rising action, of places where people have to choose. What am I going to do now? Am I going to go forward or am I going to go back? But I want to talk about one that we visited just a couple of weeks ago. I want to revisit it because it's just such a powerful story, and I know that you may be familiar with it. It's the story of the Exodus. But if you hear it in this context, I want to invite you to hear it again because I think it speaks to us in a really powerful way when we find ourselves in that moment of choice. You'll remember that at the beginning of the story, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt and their life is hard. Their taskmasters have made it so difficult for them. They're overworked, they're overburdened, they're beaten. Many of them are dying. They're unable to worship God in the way they want to worship God. They are a miserable, suffering people. Into that scenario comes Moses. And Moses has a word from God, that if they're willing to leave that place of enslavement, if they're willing to follow God, God has a new place for them. It's a place that God promises will be a land where they can determine their own future, where they can raise their families, where they can live with freedom, where they can even worship God as they choose. And this promised land is waiting for them. But in order to get there, they've got to get from where they were, enslaved, to where God tells them that they can be if they'll trust the story. The promised land. But before they can get to the promised land, they've got to move through the wilderness. And if you know the story, you know that as they move through the wilderness, there's all kinds of rising action moments. Challenges and confrontations and worries and concerns. All these reasons that they should turn around and go back. The first one comes just 1 month into the journey. They're just 1 month in the wilderness. And they're hungry. And they're thirsty, and they're tired, and some of their people have died already. And so they go to Moses and they say to Moses, we're dying out here in the wilderness, and if we're just going to die in this wilderness, we might as well go back and die in Egypt, because at least in Egypt, we had food to eat. And so at least we would die with full stomachs. Out here, we're just dying hungry and thirsty in the middle of nowhere. Well, God hears their prayers and their concerns and their worries, and God answers them by sending them every day this powdery bread-like substance called manna. And they would take the manna and they would form it into cakes and they would eat it. And the people began to eat the manna, and they were full, and they stopped complaining for a little while. Actually, a year. Just over a year after being given the manna the first time. Their bellies were full. They were no longer hungry, and they were no longer thirsty, but they were sick and tired of manna. And so this group forms. And Scripture has a very theological, very sacred and very spiritual word for them. They're called the riffraff or the rabble. The riffraff and the rabble go to the leadership. They go to Moses and they basically say, hey, we're glad that our bellies are full, but we're so tired of this manna. We want to go back to Egypt because in Egypt there's meat. And then someone else from the crowd yells out, and fish. And then someone else says, and onions, and leeks, and garlic. And then I just picture this guy way back in the back. He says, and cucumbers. Right? This is really in Scripture. Right? Listen, if things are so bad right now that you're willing to go back for cucumbers, right? Things are bad. And so there they are. They're saying, hey, we've got to go back because it might have been miserable there, but there was meat and fish and leeks and onions and garlic and cucumbers. And as they tell this story, all the people who were once satisfied with the manna, they begin to cry Because they remember the meat and the fish and the leeks and the onions and the garlic and the cucumbers. And they're standing in the doors of their tents. And tears are flowing down their face. And all of them are saying, we have got to go back. But here's the thing. If they go back, they will never know the land of milk and honey. A land overflowing with God's goodness. A land that they struggle to imagine, but a land that is promised by the one who's led them this far. They've got a choice to make. Do they go forward or do they go back? Right now, they're just in the wilderness. And they've got to make a decision. I wonder, have you ever been there? Have you ever been in a place in your life where it kind of felt like a wilderness moment? Where you weren't where you once were, right? And it doesn't really matter how we left that place. Sometimes we leave that place because we want to, because it's a bad place and we need to go somewhere else. But sometimes we leave a place we don't want to leave because we have no other choice. Regardless of how you left the place, have you ever been in that place where you left somewhere that you were? And you know, in your heart, there's got to be a place where you're going to arrive, right? A place where things are going to be better and things are going to feel settled and things are going to feel normal again. And it's this place that's over here. You're not here anymore, but you're not yet here. You're kind of right in the middle. And it kind of feels like a wilderness to you. And you wonder how you're going to get to where you want to be. And to be honest, you wonder if you can even get to where you want to be. And sometimes when you're in that moment, there's kind of a voice in the back of your head that says, there's meat, there's fish, and there's onions and leeks and garlic and cucumbers. And you think, maybe I'll just go back because going forward is just too hard. Now, I want you to think about that for just a moment, and I want you to think about it in the context of the Israelites, because if the Israelites were really to think about this, they don't really want to go back to being enslaved in Egypt, because it was awful. It was so terrible that they risked their lives and their families' lives to get out of there. It was really, really bad. But listen, we're humans, and sometimes we forget how bad things might have been before, especially when we're in the midst of the unknown and the uncertain, because even if it's bad, at least it's known. And so there's a comfort there. But really, if the Israelites were to think about it, they don't want to go back to that place because there was no hope in that place. They might have died with full bellies, but they died with empty souls. They had to get out. And so there they are journeying through the wilderness in the same way that sometimes we journey through the wilderness and we find ourselves in that place where we've got to make a decision, because the rising action of our story, before we can get to that promised place where we want to go, we get in trouble. We struggle. There's a challenge that meets us, and we're hungry and we're tired and we're worried and we're afraid, and we think maybe we just go back. I wonder if you've ever been there. It's a hard place to be, isn't it? Yeah. I've been there too, by the way. It's tough. On April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. Is at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, Martin had been leading the journey that we would come to know as the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement was a journey that was moving a people from the enslavement of unjust laws and attitudes and behaviors to a promised land of equality and freedom. And Martin and other leaders were guiding the people in many ways through a wilderness. Now, at this point in the journey, they had basically, if you will, they just kind of crossed over the Red Sea. They'd just escaped the real shackles of what was going on, and they had begun walking through this wilderness in order to get to a place that they knew would be better. But the problem is, as soon as they walked into that wilderness, they started meeting all kinds of challenges. They were beaten. They were doused with hoses of water. They were told where they could and couldn't go. Some of them were killed. And in the midst of that moment, in the midst of that wilderness, there was a group of people who went to the leadership and they said, we know it was bad, but we got to go back. Because if we keep going forward, we're all going to die in the wilderness. Martin, we got to go back. It wasn't good, but we're tired and we're hungry and we're afraid. So Martin had a word for him. A word for a people who were stuck in a wilderness, a word for a people who had a choice to make. Are we going to press on in the story? Are we going to confront the challenges? Or are we going to go back? Now, here's the thing that the people in that room at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee didn't understand. They didn't understand that these would be the last words that Martin Luther King Jr. would speak in public. Because the next day, standing on a balcony outside a hotel in that same town of Memphis, Tennessee, his life would be taken from him. I want you to hear what Martin said the night before he died about the moment in the wilderness where we have a choice. That's really something, isn't it? I mean, he didn't know what was coming. He didn't know what was going to happen the next day. But in that moment, he said, we can't turn around. We got to keep moving forward. But here's the reality of that journey. I don't think we've quite reached the promised land that Martin Luther King Jr. saw from that mountaintop. I think we've got some work to do, and I think you know that as well. But we are further now than we were then. And if they would have turned around, we wouldn't be as far as we've come. The reason we have come this far is because they refused to turn around. And that's part of what makes that story just so great. Are you starting to see how the God story is reflected in our story and how it gives us context and meaning and impact? You know, the rising action part of a movie or a novel is usually our favorite part. It's the best part, right? It's the most exciting part. It's where heroes are made. It's where relationships are formed. It's where they get to the other side of the conflict and the challenge and the worries. And it's that part of the story where we're all leaning in and we're hoping for the best, right? In a movie or in a novel, it's the rising action tension that takes us to the theaters and opens the books and gets us reading and flipping to the next page because it's so exciting. It's just so engaging. But you know what? In real life, it's the rising action part of the story that we want to get through the fastest. Because in real life, the part of the story that's in between where we were and where we want to be, it's the hardest, scariest, loneliest, most uncertain and frightening place in the world. And so what makes for a good story on the screen or in the novel makes for this thing in real life where we just want to get through because we want to know how the story ends, or at least we think we want to know how the story ends, because what if it ends in a different way and we get all caught up, right? Right? This is what I want to say to you. I know you want to get to the end. I know you want to rush there. But I just want to let you know that your story, my story, who we are, it is not defined by the once upon a time part of our story. And it's really not necessarily defined by the happily ever after part of our story. You see, our story is defined by the rising action part of our story. It's how we live in the middle of the wilderness and how we respond to the challenges and the worries and the fears and the frights and the griefs and all those things that we all have that we want to move past, but it's so hard sometimes to do so. It's really, really hard. This is the place where our faith, where our character, where our stories are really written. Look at what the Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Romans in the 5th chapter. He said, we can rejoice in our sufferings. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Will you look at the story of the Exodus? Will you look at the story of the civil rights movement? Suffering produces perseverance. And they got past perseverance and they pressed on and it developed character. And in the character of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Moses and other great leaders, it produced hope. And hope drove the people forward. See, this is what I want to say to you. If you're in a wilderness right now, and I don't care what kind of wilderness it is, I don't care how you got there, I don't care what you're struggling with, if you're not where you once were and you're not where you want to be, or if things aren't what they once were and they're not yet what you want them to be, and you're in the middle and you're tired and you're worried and you're confused and you're broken and you feel like you don't have the energy to take another step, I just want to say, don't give up. Because your story's bigger than that. Don't give up. Because the great stories, the ones that we remember, the great stories are the ones where the people, when faced with that, they continue to go forward because they're holding on to something. They're holding on to a belief that life is good and that good is worth fighting for. And sometimes we've got to press through the challenges and the worries to get to that place where we want to go, no matter how frightening it is, because we believe and we hold on to the hope that once we get there, the sun is going to shine a little bit brighter. And we're going to be in a much better place than we could have ever imagined. You know, in Jesus' life, there was a group of people and they came to him and they said, "We're so tired. We're so worn out." They said, "Jesus, you keep talking about a kingdom to come, but what about the kingdom right now? At least our ancestors in the desert, Jesus, at least the ancestors in the desert, they had manna from heaven. What do we have? Jesus, you give us a sign right now, for right now." You know what he said to them? He said, "I am the bread of life. I am the cup of salvation. I'm the cup of life. Those who come to me, they will never be hungry. And they will never thirst again." I don't know where you are in the journey right now. But I just want to say to you, wherever that may be, wherever you were and wherever you're going and wherever you are right now, those words, may they be words we never forget. And may we trust that they'll sustain us, that He will sustain us on the journey. Amen.